Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day, we are interviewing consequential leaders in the battle against the coronavirus. Some startling news today as unemployment claims increased by 5.2 million Americans, bringing the total number of unemployed to 22 million. And many are asking, could this have been prevented or at least less devastating? 15 years ago, a senator from Tennessee made a speech forecasting a deadly pandemic and calling for action to defend against it. His warnings weren't heeded. My guest today is that former senator. He's also a doctor who has played integral roles in both legislative and the healthcare policy equations, as a heart and lung transplant surgeon, and as Senate Majority Leader during the George W. Bush's presidency. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Bill Frist was one of the first to join a doctor's petition in his home state of Tennessee that urged a stay-at-home order. He's also the chairman of Nashville's COVID-19 Response Fund and host of the fantastic podcast, A Second Opinion, which I listen to every day. Senator, thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to start with the 10,000-pound gorilla that in 2005 you gave this speech, and people can read this speech at the publication The American Mind at the Clemons Institute. But you saw an animal to human pandemic coming that you said would, could be the pandemic of pandemics. And I'd like to know why you saw this coming, and given your stature in the American political system, why wasn't more done at that time heeding your call?
Steve, thank you. Before coming to the Senate back in 1994, I spent 15 years as a heart and lung transplant surgeon. The things that would kill my patients then, or come close to killing them, were these viruses. So I spent 15 years studying the viruses and how to defeat them every day. When I got to the United States Senate, not much had been done on HIV/AIDS, yet at the time it was killing as many as 3 million people around the world every year, 3 million people. The United States did mobilize at that point in time and put together a plan that successfully at least stopped, slowed down, and ultimately diminished the spread of HIV/AIDS. So I knew it could be done. Back to viruses, they're cagey, they're fast moving, they move faster than us. With our increasing transportation, being able to travel around the world, with our increased urbanization, it is inevitable that these cagey viruses were going to rear their head. And we were grossly unprepared at that standpoint, at that point in time, 15 years ago. And we are unprepared today. Hopefully that's going to change here shortly. Why didn't we do it? It requires long-term thinking. It is inevitable. We will have future pandemics in the future unless we do something that is big, that is bold, but clearly possible, and something we can afford today. This time around, we've got to get it right.
I want to read just a short clip from your piece. It says, "For what the world now faces, it is not seen even in the most harrowing episodes of the Middle Ages or the great wars of the last century. And not only are we as unprepared for rampant epidemics then, we have not taken sufficient note of the fact that though individually each might be devastating, they are susceptible of either purposeful or accidental combination, in which case they could be devastating almost beyond imagination." And in this, you're talking about the natural progression of pandemics, but in your piece, you also talk about what we can do today, which is genetically manipulate organisms and DNA. And we now see reports that perhaps this came out of some experimentation in a lab. So you wrote this 15 years ago, and you said what we need to do today, or what we needed to do then really, was to put a Manhattan Project style research effort together that was really 20 times bigger than the Manhattan Project to do this. And I'm wondering if you're still in that track now.
Yes, I am even more so today. And today we have the technology to do it. We have the know-how to do it. Back then, being the only physician in the United States Senate, there just weren't a lot of people listening. That same talk that you read from, I gave over 20 different times across the country. Now we have a teachable moment. We know what to do. We're seeing it play out before us. We can make that investment now. In that paper, I also made the call that it would come from Asia, very specifically. And it was very obvious because of the congestion there, the relationship from animal to animal and animal to human. And that leap will be made, and it will be made in the future unless we act aggressively. Now, we need to put out the fire that's underway, but at the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that we need to invest now for that next pandemic, which will come. I'll say it again, will come again in the future, regardless of what happens with the current pandemic underway.
Now, I have interviewed Dr. Anthony Fauci about a dozen times in the last many years, and he is often basically trumpeted the same alarm you are, that this is coming, that we're going to have problems. Has been worried about respiratory viruses for a long time, and says that we need to move out of just reacting and being in the reactive mode and get a research effort together that would create a platform virus that would take these things on in advance. And so I guess I'd like to ask you if you're aligned with that, if I'm understanding both you and Fauci correctly. And then secondly, isn't that a powerful combination of doctors and scientists? What's stopping that kind of common sense prognostication from getting more traction politically today?
Well, politically, and it's not just the partisan environment, it is a lack of long term thinking. And therefore, for our political figures to understand, to take action, to respond, we need to have a mass understanding advocacy from the American people, who now everybody is feeling it today, the pain, the suffering, especially our most vulnerable. So now is the time to do it. It takes a coordinated plan to do it. Back in the talk and the speech and the essay that I wrote, which people can get, as you mentioned, in the American Mind, I had a 6-point plan, which starts with communications. And with technology today, that is not as big an issue, although right now I wish there was more accurate information coming from our national figures. And second, surveillance, and that surveillance has to be global. We need to continue our partnerships with people like the World Health Organization, because viruses don't have visas and pandemics they just don't know borders at all. Thirdly, we need to focus on antiviral agents and do the appropriate research in support of the private sector developing these agents. Although we think this current pandemic is going to take another, Dr. Fauci says 12 months or 18 months. I don't agree with that. I think that if we put more emphasis today on the antiviral agents, we can maybe not reverse, but damp this thing down dramatically and get people back to work. And that's what I talked about in 2005. Fourthly, vaccines. We need a Manhattan Project on the vaccines so we don't have to wait a year. We have the technology today with what's called messenger RNA vaccines and not the traditional vaccines. We should have invested over the last 15 years, but it's not too late for the future now to begin that investment. And then I talked about initially research and development in the larger sense. We underinvest in science in this country, and now is the time to do that. There's some people at the national level who dismiss science, and now every single American understands the importance of that science. And lastly, the whole stockpile and surge capacity. These are the 6 things that I talk about. And once again, even though we called for it, our stockpiles have been totally inadequate, whether it's ventilators or antiviral agents or the other agents of protection of PPE, the protection equipment that we need today. We need to address the stockpile. Those are the 6 sort of things that we have to prevent another pandemic. Tom Daschle and I wrote the op-ed that you published that basically talked about establishing an infrastructure fund, public health infrastructure fund, to focus on it. And we came to a figure of about $5 billion a year. We're spending trillions of dollars now globally. So we're talking about a small amount, $5 billion a year, to establish a fund to support infrastructure of public health, which would include these 6 approaches.
One of the things that I have learned in the last few days talking to scientists affiliated with Gilead and Pfizer and GSK, Johnson & Johnson and others that are all engaged in various parts of searches for antiviral agents and vaccines potentially and therapies, is they said they're bending the curve of how long it takes to get a therapy in place, that they're working together and collaborating in ways, sharing data in ways that they never have before. Some are calling this chaos and uncontrolled. Others are saying this is the way it has to happen if we're going to move the curve from being a 1.5 to 2 year response to the 6 to 9 month that you're advocating. I know you talk to the same people, and I've been listening. I've been inspired by your podcast. What is your sense of what's really possible today on the science front?
I am excited about it. We look so much to our public sector, our government officials, people like myself in the past as a leader of the Senate or the President of the United States. The real power of America is this private sector of creativity, of dynamism, of partnering with the guidelines set by the federal government. But the real energy and the impetus and the momentum comes from our private sector. It takes a certain degree of messiness, of chaos, because you're constantly experimenting, you're trying new ideas, things out of the box, which ultimately can be the greatest therapy or the greatest potential cure. It's going to come from something you may not appreciate is important today, but you need to apply that scientific discipline of hypotheses, of null hypotheses, of cohort studies, of science to demonstrate the efficacy. And now that's underway. And most of the progress that's going to be made over the next 3 months, the 6 months, is going to be in our scientific, our pharmaceutical industry, many times painted as sort of the enemies when you make too much money. But that's where the great discoveries are going to come. They're going to damp down this current spread transmission of this terrible infection and allow us to get back to work and capture the greatness of America once again.
Senator, I want to ask your view on the tug of war that seems to be breaking out between those that want to give this virus more of a chance to be beaten down, knocked out of our society, and controlled, contained, tracked, get testing in place, versus those who want to open up the economy and open up the aperture of, if you will, of what they're willing to tolerate by way of further infections. And I don't know if I've characterized that right, but that's the way I see it. And I'm wondering where you are in that tug of war. I know you're dealing with Tennessee. I don't know where Tennessee is. I know in Pennsylvania that the state Senate in Pennsylvania vote to override the governor on stay-at-home orders. And there's a lot of tension there. Where are you in this?
Well, the challenge that we have today is the biology of the virus. And whatever happens with our economy, by definition, is going to follow what we do with the virus. And the virus has a mind of its own. We have two tracks. The public health track says shut everything down. That's going to save the most lives. The economic track says, well, we have to have a dose of reality here. This virus is really deadly to maybe only 2 or 3%. We don't know what it is of the population. The other 98% need to be able to live a semi-normal life, going back to work in order to put food on the table, to escape the travesty of poverty, which also has a huge economic cost. The policymakers have to operate in both of those. Some states are more on the public health side, some on the economic side. The more science we have, the more testing, and this nation has failed in terms of testing from the top to the bottom, but the more testing we have and that we create, it allows you to get the information to more smartly open the government. Open the businesses, get people back to work, get people back to school. So I think we don't have enough data yet, but it's coming in fast every day. I think we need an open data platform today that we can feed the best of testing, of science, of surveillance, of symptoms into, to gradually begin to open things beginning in about a couple of weeks in those areas that are not at risk for a surge. And with that, titrate how much opening up, closing down, opening up, and closing down, starting with target populations. For example, most hospitals in the country today are totally empty or 90% empty or 80% empty. I can see very soon beginning to open those hospitals, bringing our health personnel back to work, maybe starting with a younger cohort than an older cohort. But I think that can begin in about 2 to 3 weeks in certain parts of the country, not at the federal level, but in certain parts of the country.
Right. Senator, just in our very last bit of the show here, Can I ask you about, I know you've advocated this national response portal, and data is so important to make that work. Testing is so important. In short form, you know how this government works. Why is getting the testing frame right so difficult? Do you have any solutions that you know of that we should be considering to get testing fixed?
I think, number one, the leadership of this country should stop telling the American people that we have enough tests today. They've been telling them that for 3 weeks. That slows everybody down across the board, the scientists, the laboratories. So we need, number one, to say we still need more testing. Number two, I think we are making real progress today, but I think tax credits, tax incentives can still be given to those people who are bringing testing on board today to accelerate it. Number three, I think that a code can be given, an ICD type code. ICD 10 is just a code where you can get reimbursement for both the testing, but also the surveillance and participating in what's called contact testing. So those are three things that we can do, that we should do, but we need to put that on the table as we go forward.
Well, we'll leave it there. I want to thank Senator Bill Frist for joining me, and I want to thank all of you for joining us at the Coronavirus Report. Stay well, and see you tomorrow.